Alexander, thanks a lot for inviting me to talk. This is pretty cool. Hello, my name is Neil Peterson. I'm a program manager in the Microsoft Developer Tools division. And my my role is PM on the Visual Studio Code extension for Azure Resource Manager Templates. And like Alexander said, we're going to look at that quite a bit. Here's my Twitter handle if you want to make a connection, or if you have any questions or any follow-up, feel free to reach out. And I'll show you kind of where, if you're using the tools, where you can open issues and communicate with us as well. So this talk, hold on. I put together this talk pretty quickly. It's pretty light on slides. We're going to do a lot of demo, and essentially we're going to, if you're new to Azure Resource Manager Templates, I will kind of introduce and walk through all of the components of an Azure Resource Manager template. If you're experienced with Azure Resource Manager Templates, I will show how the Visual Studio Code extension, or ARM tools for VS Code, which we like to call it, can assist you in building your Azure Resource Manager templates. Before I go on, Alexander or someone else on the call, can you just confirm that you can hear me well and everything is good on this end?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, great. Thank you. So kind of just a rough agenda. We're going to talk about Azure Resource Manager, kind of basically very quick overview on how Azure is built. I've got no service. I've now created a service. How do I take it from that to being able to deploy that service? And we'll set a little bit of vocabulary in that section. We'll then talk about okay, what are my options for deploying stuff in Azure? We'll then dig in ARM templates. We'll write a template from scratch. We'll see how we can deploy templates, and then just a quick note on extensibility. But like I said, this is if you're new, we'll talk about ARM templates. If you're experienced, we'll talk about the tools. And there's just going to be one big demo here where we're going to write a template from scratch and kind of see how those tools will help in that process. Cool. So what is Azure Resource Manager? Azure Resource Manager is a control plane for creating and managing Azure resources and services. And what happens here is say we've got a team at Microsoft and they develop this new cool feature or service for Azure. They're going to code that up, do kind of all the magic and stuff that they do on their end. And eventually what's going to happen is we're going to have a REST interface that allows us to provision, get information, delete, and really just manage that new service. And all of these REST interfaces, our input to those is the Azure Resource Manager control plane. Once they have that REST interface, something called a Swagger, or actually I should have updated that, Open API is what we're calling it now, but basically a specification for that REST interface is created. And this is just like the contract. If I'm going to create a storage account through the REST interface, that REST call needs to be configured in a certain way. Actually, I'm going to turn my camera on, see if we can do that. Oh, hello. So, we create the service, we create the REST interface, then we've got this Swagger that is that contract that shows us, or that we need to construct our REST calls against to successfully engage with that REST interface. From that Swagger, we then create an Azure schema for that service. So for instance, we've got an Azure schema for storage accounts. And these schemas, let me back up to the Swagger a little bit. What is this useful for? We can do things like automatically create tools from the Swagger. So I don't know what tools we're automatically creating from there, but conceivably, if you were building a client for Azure, rather than going in and coding up all of the calls to the REST interfaces yourself, you could use that Swagger to automatically generate like pieces of that client. We then, from that Swagger or Open API spec, we create these resource schemas. And it's just kind of like a pared down, easier to read and parse description of the things that need to be in those calls to hit those REST interfaces. And the reason I bring this up is because once we get into looking at the tools, like the Azure schemas are pretty important, and I'll show you exactly why. But you can see on the diagram that like basically whatever tool you're using to interface with Azure is ultimately going to go through this control plane to create those services, manage those services. And if you've been around for a while, you'll know that we didn't have this Azure Resource Manager control plane when Azure was initially built. So it's something new within the last, I think it was 2014, 2015 when it was released, but just really a modern control plane. I think I got one last thing in here. And this is just more of the vocabulary, which will be relevant when we start talking about provisioning Azure resources. And there's this concept of control plane, which is, you know, we can create the Azure resources themselves. We've got REST interfaces, we've got tools, we've got SDKs, which we'll talk about more, for creating virtual machines, storage accounts, AKS clusters. But there's also this concept of the data plane, and that is kind of the things that we can't really touch necessarily using Azure Resource Manager. So this would be things like I've created a Cosmos database via the control plane, but I want to populate it with data. Like we can't, you know, we don't have access to populate a Cosmos DB using Azure Resource Manager. Or another example would be that I've created a virtual machine through the Azure Resource Manager control plane, but I then need to get into what we're going to call the data plane and do something inside of that VM. So just want to kind of delineate between what we can do with Azure Resource Manager and what we might not necessarily be able to do. However, we will talk about some extensibility features which allow us to get into that data plane or configure those services. So let's just take a quick demo and just see an example of the REST interfaces. All right, so I have not written a whole lot of PowerShell in the last couple of years, so please excuse my quick PowerShell job here. So what I want to do is create a storage account using just the REST interface. So I've got the documentation here, and what we can see is that we've actually got a REST interface here. And if we kind of look at the format of this, so we've got HTTPS management.azure.com, subscriptions, the subscription ID for the subscription you're working in, the resource group, or I'm sorry, a declaration of resource group, the resource group name in which you want to create that storage account, providers, and here we can see the storage specific stuff. So now we're getting right into, okay, Microsoft storage, so resource provider, storage accounts, the name of the storage account, and then the API version. You know, let's talk about this really quickly. I didn't mention it before. So as resources are updated, revisioned in Azure, they get new API versions. So we can see here we've got an API version of 2019-06-01, but conceivably there's a bunch of different API versions for storage accounts. So if you are in a situation where your environment's very, very controlled and maybe you're using a version from 2018 and you don't want to update to the latest, you know, we give you that capability to version the resources and pick which version of that resource you're going to use. So this is kind of the endpoint for creating storage accounts. And we can come in, and I'm just going to kind of burn through most of this. I think there's an example. Oh yeah, let's see. So if we look at the request body, these are the parameters that we're going to pass to that endpoint to create the storage account. I just want to point out the required ones. So when creating a storage account, we need to specify the kind, the location, and I'm looking at this required column here, and then finally the SKU. So we've got documentation for all of these REST interfaces. Let's go ahead and see how that looks when we actually use any client, any REST-enabled client to create that storage account. So here I'm just getting kind of my authentication details from Key Vault. I'm just specifying a couple things here. I'm actually going to change the resource group name to REST Demo 2, and I'm going to create that resource group real quick. So here I'm just using the Azure CLI to create the resource group. I just need it pre-created. I could also use a REST call to create the resource group if I wanted to.
Neil, can you increase the font a little? Font size a little? Please,
sure.
Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes, but
okay.
Also in the terminal is a little bit small.
I don't know how to. I'll tell you what, when I'm working in the terminal, which I won't be doing a whole lot of, I will increase it there. All right, cool. So here's the resource group name that I'm going to create, the name that I want to give the storage account. Here I'm just getting a bearer token, which we've got that documented if you want to kind of learn more about that. I'm then constructing the header. And before I go on, kind of what I'm doing here is I'm showing kind of like the raw experience. Like if we wanted to do this via the REST interface, and kind of the logical flow of this talk is we're going to look at this and it's like, man, that, you know, wow. And then we're going to see how to make this easier. We're going to see how templates kind of help us manage and create these services. So I've got the header that I'm creating, and then I've got the body that I'm going to send to that REST interface. And you'll notice here that when we talked through that documentation, there were a couple required things, which I have here, the SKU, the kind, and the location. So I've just built, I've just gathered the authentication pieces. I've built kind of the header and the body for my REST call. And then finally, I'm building out the URI, which is just that endpoint. So I'm doing things like substituting in my subscription ID, the resource group name, and then a couple other things like the storage account name. And then I'm specifying the API version. And then I'm just going to use the invoke REST method command to create the put to create the resource, the storage resource. So I'm going to go ahead and run this now. So I'll do, caps lock is on. And then so for me, like this is not the way I want to work. There's many other options for creating things in Azure, and we'll dig into those now. But I did want to show this. So if I come back over to the portal, I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. There's the resource group that we created, REST Demo 2, and it does take so we basically just like submitted the REST call. Things are working on the back end, and eventually the storage account will show up here. Also, one thing I want to point out here, though, is look at this deployment section right here, and we can see that we've got no deployments. And this is important, and I'm going to kind of come back to like what this is and the importance of that. But for right now, just kind of take a mental note that when we're using those service-specific REST interfaces, it's just kind of like a raw call, like boom, like go create me a storage account. But when we start using Azure Resource Manager Templates, and specifically we have a deployment specific API, which we might take a look at as well, we start like layering on some really cool goodies So you'll see some of the benefits from moving from like these service-specific APIs to the deployment API itself, which we use with Azure Resource Manager Templates. So there we can see we've got our storage account. So I just wanted to, just kind of give a demonstration of kind of like Azure at its most raw form. So, cool. We know, at a very, very, very high level that we create a service, we put an API on it, we generate Swagger, we generate schemas, and we can interface with that in a very raw method. But what are the really, really nice things? And, I probably should have rephrased this because really nice things, well, REST interfaces are pretty nice. And in fact, something interesting is happening within the developer tools group as we're looking at patterns and what customers are doing. Actually, a lot of customers are using those REST interfaces just directly, like quite a bit of customers are. So just kind of a side note is that there are some initiatives to really kind of look at those and think about that experience and not just the tools that we build on top of those REST interfaces. So, I say we're the really nice things, but to some people, maybe those REST interfaces are the really nice things. But so what are their other options? Let me just blow this out. So we've got SDKs. If you're writing in Python or Go or .NET and you want to engage with Azure, we've got software development kits that take care of a lot of that stuff that I just did in that PowerShell script for you. We also have the Azure CLI, which we saw in the previous demo. That's what I used to create the resource group with. So just a pretty simple command line tool. We've got an Azure PowerShell module as well. We've got Azure Resource Manager Templates, which is the focus for the rest of this talk. And then there's a bunch of other stuff, Terraform, Pulumi, potentially other open source tools. Although, inadvertently, these are using SDKs or the REST interfaces themselves. But like I said, the focus of this call is Azure Resource Manager Templates. So what is an Azure Resource Manager template or an ARM template? Just at its most bare bones, an ARM template is our native implementation of infrastructure as code for Azure. So Azure Resource Manager templates allow us to create resources within Azure. But let's get into kind of some of the fine details. And I just put a bunch of words on here. I'll talk through all of them. So Azure Resource Manager templates allow you to codify these REST API calls in a very declarative way. So you can kind of see the example there on the side. We're actually we're going to build this in the demonstration, but this is creating a storage account. But we just basically declare like, hey, I want a storage account. I want you to use this API version. Go ahead, put this tag on it, put it in this location. This is the kind and the SKU that I want to use in a very declarative fashion. And what I mean by declarative is that you just declare what you want, and the ARM template or the Azure Resource Manager control plane just makes it so. Now I do have a little asterisk there because while it is a very declarative language, there are some imperative constructs. An example might be, like, let's say I needed 2 storage accounts, and they're going to be configured very similarly. They obviously have different names. I could author my ARM template such that it has 2 storage accounts in it, but we have some kind of imperative or programming constructs such as looping conditions. So there are some things in there that aren't exactly declarative like, and we'll see those in the demonstration. So the next thing is idempotent. What this means is that I can create an Azure Resource Manager template, specify my storage account. Maybe I've got 7 resources in it, a storage account, a bunch of other things. I can then deploy that template. If I then deploy that template again, kind of the Azure Resource Manager control plane and the deployment API will, look at the body of my template, look at what's in Azure and say, you know what, this is already done. There's nothing to change here. Whereas if I then went and added like an 8th resource, redeploy, it would go, okay, well, these 7 have already been deployed, but this 8th has not. So let's just add just this 8th resource. So, the real value here is that ARM itself takes care of a lot of that logic. Whereas if you were writing your own scripts, let's say you were writing a PowerShell script that has 7 resources in it, and you ran that PowerShell script, and then you just ran it again, it might throw an error stating like, hey, I can't create this storage account because a storage account with the same name already exists. Now you could potentially, craft that PowerShell script so that it itself is idempotent, but you would have to put all that logic in there yourself, which, might not be a big deal, but it is one of kind of the big differences between writing scripts and code to create these Azure resources and using an idempotent solution like Azure Resource Manager Templates, or Terraform would be another example of an idempotent solution. I've got a little asterisk next to this one as well, because there are some resources that don't really work very well in an idempotent fashion. The one that I'm aware of is AKS, so Azure Kubernetes Service. I think it's got some service-specific issues with idempotency, but I know that's being looked at. So dependency graph and parallel deployments. So when you're building an ARM template, and we'll look at this as well. When you're building an ARM template, let's say you've got 5 resources in it, resource 4 might depend on 3 already existing. So you can build dependencies in your Azure Resource Manager template. Deploy 1, 2, and 3, and only once when 3 has been created, then deploy 4. And the cool thing about this is that you define your dependencies, but if there are no dependencies, so if I've got 5 resources and there's no dependencies, it's going to deploy all 5 resources kind of in a parallel fashion. So you get these efficiencies, this parallel efficiencies, but you also have the ability to create dependencies and build that dependency graph. They're modular, so we don't have to have just one big resource manager template. We can actually create modules and use something called link or nested templates, so that I can have like a parent template that calls out to like my standard VM template, then my standard storage template. So we do have some modularity there, and they're extensible. So we talked about the data plane and the control plane, and this has been a big kind of thing. Like, hey, there's only so much I can do with ARM templates. Like, I've got this application that includes a Kubernetes cluster, and I need to get into that Kubernetes cluster and start some containers to fully deploy my application. And traditionally that's been very, very difficult. The same thing for like virtual machines. So there are some extension points, quite a few actually. One example would be, we've got these things called VM extensions. So an example would be the custom script extension for Windows or Linux VMs. And what this allows us to do is, in our ARM template, we define the VM, and then we define the extension, that this custom script extension, which defines like, hey, once this VM is deployed, run this script. So you can then, kind of include in your source control the template, the script, you deploy it, it creates the VM. It's pretty cool. You don't need, like, the VM doesn't need access to the internet or anything. Azure takes care of it for you. It pulls the script into the VM and runs it. Another one which I was hoping to demo today, but I just couldn't pull the demo together quick enough, is a new, it's in kind of public preview, a new resource type called deployment script. So if you're interested, just jot that down. Azure Resource Manager deployment script. We've got docs on it and samples. And this is a new resource type that executes a script. So you can include this in your ARM template. So potentially I deploy an AKS cluster, and then I can use the deployment script resource to do something with that AKS cluster. And there are a couple other extensible extensibility options for Azure Resource Manager templates. Day one support, this is kind of one of the big ones for ARM templates. We kind of walked through how things are made in Azure. In one of the side benefits of that is that with ARM templates, we have access. I mean, there potentially could be some edge cases. I'm not aware of any, but I don't want to. I wanted to call that out that like anything's possible. But in general, we have day one support for all resources in Azure. Oop. Validation and testing. So we've got, the first thing I want to talk about is the validation API. So we've got a validation API, and this is kind of up to each resource provider to like poke in the validation tests that they surface through the validation API. But anytime you make an ARM template deployment, it runs a series of validation steps before it deploys. Now, if you've done Resource Manager templates and you're like, well, in the past, I've deployed a template and it ran for 10 minutes and then it failed. That's just an issue. That's either something's just wrong, or we haven't, like, that service itself hasn't hooked up any validation for the specific scenario in which caused the failure. But there's quite a bit of validation going on in there. The other thing we have is, it's kind of new, is kind of a static code analysis testing framework called the Azure Template Toolkit. And it allows you to define things like, all of, let's say, you want like your storage account names all to be lowercase. You can use the ARM templating toolkit to analyze the ARM template and validate, like, hey, if I've defined a storage account name, it must have the to-lower function, which we'll talk about functions. The name must use the to-lower function to ensure that that storage account name is always lowercase. Deployment history. So this is a point that we saw in the demo. When I deployed that storage account through the storage specific REST interface, I pointed to the top of the portal and I said, hey, look, there's no deployment there. When we use Azure Resource Manager Templates, and specifically there's another REST interface called deployment, which we'll see. I'll show it to you. When we go through that interface, the deployment REST interface, it kind of fans out the deployments to all of the service-specific interfaces, but it also kind of keeps a history of that deployment. So when using Azure Resource Manager Templates, if I deployed that storage account through an Azure Resource Manager template, that deployment thing would have had one deployment, and I could drill into it and kind of see what occurred. I can see the inputs, the outputs. So using Azure Resource Manager Templates, we get this natively, we get this history of what has been deployed. And there's a bunch of other things. I mean, I can continue to rattle on all of the things that we can do with ARM templates, things like CI, CD integration, etc. So that's kind of just a quick overview of ARM templates. And like I said, we will spend the bulk, kind of the second half of this talk, just building one. But once I have an ARM template, what are the ways I can deploy it? And there are several. So we can use the Azure CLI, we can use Azure PowerShell, we can use the Azure Portal. And I bring this one up because I use it quite a bit. I think it's pretty cool if I just want to quickly see something happen. And I've run into several customers that just don't know it exists. And that's what the screenshot is right here. So we've got this ability to just copy a template into the portal and deploy it right from the portal. If you've used Azure Resource Manager Templates, potentially you've seen, like in GitHub repositories, a button that says deploy to Azure. All that button is doing is it's taking the template from the source code repository and using the portal's capability to deploy that template. So when you hit that button, it takes the template, it opens the portal, drops the template in essentially, which is what you're seeing here. And then there's a REST interface for deploying Azure Resource Manager templates as well. And there are others, believe it or not. Terraform itself can deploy Azure Resource Manager templates. So if you've used Terraform, it's just another infrastructure as code solution. Some of the real big benefits there, and I think Mark Gray is going to be talking about it at some point throughout today. But it's got a couple cool capabilities, like it's got providers that are multi-cloud, so you can use Terraform to deploy stuff to multi-clouds. But it works on something called providers, and there is an Azure provider for Terraform. In some cases, it doesn't have support for all resources, although we are trying to get there. But if you do hit some edge cases where like, man, I'm using Terraform, but dang, it doesn't, the provider doesn't yet have the capability for this one resource, you can actually insert ARM template into Terraform deployments as well. All right, cool. And that was actually the last of my slides. And I've got about 15 or so minutes here left. So let's take a look at some ARM templates. Before doing so, I just wanted to point out this one more REST call. I was going to run it, but I'm not going to. So this looks very similar to kind of the raw deployment of the storage account that we just created. But if we look down here at the URI, notice here that instead of Microsoft.storage and storage accounts, I believe it was, we've got Microsoft.resources deployments. So there is a REST interface for ARM deployments. Like I said, it kind of fans out the deployments to the service-specific REST interfaces. And one of the benefits of using this REST interface is that we get the validation and we get that deployment history, which is pretty cool. And this is also the same kind of interface that ARM templates themselves are going to use. So if I was to deploy this, and if we look at it, my body, you can see some of the stuff that we had. So the kind, the SKU, the storage account name. But what we're seeing in here for the body is actually an ARM template. So don't worry about the syntax and stuff. We're going to go and look at that. But the difference here is where I use the storage account. There's a body specific to creating a storage account. Where when I use the deployment API, we're actually deploying a template as the body. So that said, let's take a look really quick at the tools that we're going to be looking at. So if you're interested, you can go to aka.ms whack ARM tools. And this is the Azure Resource Manager tools for VS Code. This is the product that I manage. From here, you can find out more information about the tools. There's also a link here to the GitHub repository, and I'm just getting this out of the way now. But if you are using the tools and you run into issues, definitely feel free to open up an issue. I'm in here daily. I try to respond to all issues within a day. We've got some developers that are pretty responsive as well. And yeah, so that's the main tool that we're going to see. Now there are some other cool tools for developing ARM templates in VS Code. One to mention is there's Ben Coleman has an extension for visualizing ARM templates, and there are some other things that might help you as you go. But let's go ahead and start building a template using the Azure Resource Manager extension for VS Code. Now I'm using a pre-release version here. I decided I want to show off just a couple cool little capabilities that we've got coming up just in a couple of weeks. So not everything that we're going to see today is available right now, but I'll call those out when we see them. So I've got 10.0-alpha in here. Our current version is 0.91. So with that said, let's go ahead and build an ARM template from scratch. And I'll call it out. ARM templates aren't necessarily the most easy thing to write. We've received tons of feedback around how difficult they are, and they're built. The language is based on JSON. I wouldn't exactly call it JSON anymore, but it's definitely not the easiest thing to write and parse as a human. There's a huge initiative, like massive initiative going on right now to really kind of examine ARM, the templating language, and how to make this easier. And part of that is the tool that we're going to see here. So it's a huge investment on our part to, this tool is a huge investment on our part, and the goal is really just to make the authoring experience easier. But we admit it. There's a lot we can do and are going to do to improve the experience. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a file named azure deploy.json. One thing notice down here, it might be a little hard to see, but in the bottom right-hand corner of VS Code, right now VS Code is recognizing this file as a JSON file. All right, so the first thing I'm going to use from, and that's important, and we'll come back to that language type down there. First thing I want to do is scaffold out my template. So I'm going to use a feature of the Azure Resource Manager tools, snippet feature. You may have, if you've used the tools in the past, we kind of, Sam Kogan, an MVP, believe, initially created an extension for this. We kind of adopted what he was doing, and we've got some updates that we're going to make as well. But it's just an easy way to scaffold out our templates and add resources to our templates. So I'm going to type in ARM and then exclamation point, and boom, I've got kind of the bare bones Azure Resource Manager template in front of me. So I'll go through kind of all the sections here. The first one is a schema. And so we can actually deploy Azure Resource Manager templates to a couple different scopes. We can deploy them to resource groups, subscriptions, management groups, and tenants. In fact, if I was to take this out of here, delete that, I'm going to hit Control Space on my keyboard, and you can see all of the different scopes that we can deploy to. So I can actually like click subscription. And what these schemas hold, I was actually going to show them, but in the sake of time, I'm not going to. But if you were to go to this URL and look at this schema, I'll just pull it up real quick. It's hard to read. Actually, I'll just do it. We'll make it work. I'm going to create a file here. I'll drop that in there. Let me format it. So what these schemas do is they kind of specify a bunch of things, but including the resource types that can go into the deployment. So we're deploying, I actually pulled the schema for the subscription level deployment, so we can see very subscription level things in here, like policy definitions. Somewhere in here is like resource groups. Yeah, there we go, resource groups. So these schemas kind of hold, the schema for the template. So if I was to add something like a storage account to this template, it would know based on this schema, like, hey, that's not a valid resource type for this scope. So I didn't, for kind of actually most of my career, as I've been writing ARM templates, I didn't really understand exactly what those schemas were doing, and that's it. And what they do is it points to like all the resources that I can put in this template. It actually points to the schemas for all the resources that I can put in this template. I can then drill into those resources and see the schema of how those resources should be configured. The next thing is a content version. This is just a way that you can version your ARM templates. Coming down, we've got parameters. And what this is like as I'm creating my storage account or whatever resource it might be, I might want to take user input to give the storage account a name, for example. And this is where I would define those inputs. So we can think of parameters as inputs, and we'll create one of those in a second. Functions is a relatively new capability. I haven't worked with them much myself, but if you find yourself doing like some complex like string concatenation, excuse me, over and over again, like maybe you bring in a prefix, so like you want all your resources to be named like prod dash something, you can create a function to produce the end result of like the complex string concatenation rather than doing it 4 or 5 times or however many times throughout your template. So functions just allow you to do that. We're not going to use functions. I'm not going to build any functions, so I'm just going to remove that from the template to just kind of keep it as simple as possible. Variables are very similar to parameters. They allow us to provide some data throughout the template. An example might be like maybe I'm going to specify a location, and I specify that on all my resources, and now I want to change that location. Instead of having to go resource by resource and changing the location, I can just change it in the variable. The big difference is parameters, we can bring that input from the outside. Variables are self-contained. So there's no way to like update those. Well, there's no direct way to update those kind of at runtime. I can have a variable that contains a parameter, and so like when I run the template, I provide the parameter value, and that might potentially update the variable, but Just think of variables as inputs. I'm sorry, parameters as inputs and variables as something contained within the template. However, we use them in a very similar way. The next section is our resources. This is where we're going to define all our resources, and I'm going to leave it at that because we're going to spend most of our time there. And then finally, we have an output section. And outputs allow me to do a couple things. First, like if I wanted to like echo something back to the screen after I've deployed the template, I can use it to do that. But also in the slide deck, we talked about modularity. So if I'm linking two templates together, I can take the output from one template and it can serve as the input to another template. All right, so let's get cracking here and create an ARM template from scratch. So the first thing I want to do is add a resource, and we're just going to deploy a storage account here. And again, I'm going to use my snippets to add my storage account. So I'm going to type in ST, and I can see that I've got a snippet there, ARM storage, and I'll just go ahead and add that. Now with our snippets, with our snippets, you can use the tab key. Oop. Let me just start over again. You can use the tab key to kind of tab through some of the configurable properties and set those. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to actually just start updating this thing. Now, every resource is going to have a name. In this case, we've got storage account 1, a type. We've got Microsoft.storage, storage accounts, an API version. This is a tag that I'm going to tag onto that storage account, a location, and then there's some properties that you're going to configure for that storage account. But you know, there's going to be some common properties on all resources, particularly these ones that we set up here at the top. Now at this point, I have a valid template. Like I can go deploy this thing. But let's make some updates, generalize it. But I also want to show like some of the kind of the most impressive, in my opinion, feature of the ARM tools extension that we're using here. You know, we've heard ARM templates are hard to build. We don't know all the properties. We don't know exactly what needs to be where. So a couple things that I want to show off now is validation and auto completion. We talked a lot about schemas. You know, we create the REST interface, we create Swagger, we create schemas from those. We define the schemas that were available to us up here in this line 2 of this template. We use those schemas inside of our ARM tools to validate and provide auto completion capabilities for our resources. So if I come in here to like line 15, we can see I've got kind storage v2. I'm going to update this to like mega storage. And we can see that my kind now has a yellow squiggle on it. If I hover over that, you can see that mega storage, it's basically telling me mega storage is not a valid value for the kind property. And then it gives a list of the valid, that's funny, I actually just pointed at my screen as if you can see. But it gives a list of valid values. Okay, cool. But like what if, how do I get to those valid values? So now I've removed mega storage. My cursor is between the quotes there. If I hit Control Space, you can see that we've got some auto completion on those values. So I'm actually just going to get bold here and start building a resource by hand. So I'm going to put a comma in there and just start a new resource declaration. So I'm going to hit double quotes, and we can see that IntelliSense here now is detected like, okay, you're starting a new resource. So let's put in a type. Double quotes again, and it's a little hard to see because of the font size, but what we've done now is we're going into this schema and listing all of the resource types that are available to the scope that we're deploying. So let me do storage account. All right, I can hit comma. All right, API version. And so now we've got the list of all of the valid API versions. And you can see now using these tools that I've got the ability essentially to kind of walk the tree. And honestly, it's I've done it a couple times now, and it gets easier as you go, but we have access to the shape and required properties and configurations that we need for these resources. If you look over here, we get some information about each one, and I can kind of click through and see the ones that are required. So I can see here that kind is required. So I can add that in, and then boom, I got access to the kinds. And I can keep going, but essentially build from scratch these resources. Now, admittedly, the storage account resources is pretty simple. That's kind of why I'm choosing it. This would get a little more difficult as you were doing things like virtual machines. But in that case, we always have our snippets. So I'm going to do like Ubuntu, and boom, I've just added in all of the resources, fully configured, able to go for a virtual machine. I think right now I'm going to remove the virtual machine, but I think this is because I've got so many resources on the screen. This is also a good opportunity to show off the ARM template outline. So I'm going to expand this right here. And again, I know it's a little hard to see, but I'll kind of walk through what we've got going on here. So the ARM template outline is just, it gives us the ability to navigate through these resource template or ARM templates, because they can get big. I mean, there's templates out there with thousands and thousands of lines and a bunch of resources. So we can see here a list of parameters and variables, which I have none. We've got resources. And what's cool here is, like, if I wanted to navigate directly to this public IP address, I can do that. I just click on the public IP address, and it's highlighted all of the templating language for that public IP address. Some places where I use this a lot is, like, if I've got a big ARM template and I want to delete a resource, like, let me just go ahead and delete this storage account right here. I can just click on it, hit the delete key. I do need to remove that comma. We've got an open issue for that. And that was much easier than having to kind of like visually go in, find the start and stop of that resource, and delete it manually. Let me see if I have any nested resources here. I don't. Let me do this. Show off one other cool feature. Let me put in a SQL server. Oh, that wasn't it. In any regards, when building ARM templates, there are situations where you have a parent resource and a child resource. And child resources can either be nested inside of the parent or at the root level. And in situations where they are nested in the parent, you can actually expand the parent, and then we would have a resources section in here. You can expand that and manage those nested child resources in the same way. So that's the ARM template outline. Okay, now let's go ahead and add, we want to generalize this thing. So I talked about parameters being kind of the input. We want, in this case, I want to add a parameter so I can give the storage account a name. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to put my cursor in parameters. I'm going to use snippets to add a parameter. I'm going to give it a name of storage name, and I'll do the same for description. And then I know, because I've been working with storage accounts for a while, that a storage account name has a minimum character limit of 3, so it has to be at least 3 characters and a maximum of 24. So I'm going to put a comma in here, and in our parameter declaration, we can kind of define some of those constraints. So I just put in double quotes, and again, using Schema IntelliSense, I can see all of the values that I can set on a parameter. One of those being min length. So I'll put in 3, and then I'll do a max length, and I'll put in 4. Cool. So there is my parameters. However, notice I've got a yellow squiggly on this thing. If I hover over that, we can see that the parameter storage name is never used. So let me go ahead and now use that. So I'm going to come down here to the name section. I'll remove the name, and we're going to use what's called an ARM template function. And there is a bunch of functions for ARM templates. Some examples might be to lower. Like if I want to make sure that all characters are lowercase, I've got a function for that. Another example would be concat. If I want to concat a couple different strings or values, I can use the concat function. In this case, I'm going to use a function called the parameter function, which returns the value of the parameter that's specified in the function. And we've got IntelliSense for that. And not only do we have IntelliSense for that, but it's kind of intelligent. So I'm going to start my expression using a square bracket. I'm going to select the parameters function, and that brings up a list of functions. I'll specify the parameters function. I can actually hover over this and get a signature for that function, get some information about how it needs to be constructed. Not very hard for parameters, but when you get into things like concat and some of the other more advanced functions, it's pretty helpful to see what's going on. I will put in the opening brackets, and notice that it immediately returns a list of all the parameters in my current template. In this case, I only have one, but if there were multiples in there, we would see that.
Neil?
Yep.
Just to let you know, you have 10 minutes to a full hour, okay?
Cool, appreciate it. I'm gonna wrap up here pretty quickly.
Okay.
So we put in the parameter, we've generalized the template. I can now specify a name at deployment time. Some other cool things to note here is that we've got some color coding going on. It's a little hard to see with the white background, but if I was to flip this over to black, we would see that our parameters are in blue. I believe our variables are in green. Our functions are in yellow. The other cool thing here is that we support comments, which has not always been the case. I've got a choice here. I was going to do two more things. One was to show some kind of the imperative options for the templates. I think I'm going to skip on that one, but I'll just talk through it really quickly. So if I did want to create two storage accounts, I could easily just add another storage account in here. But, you know, let's say I had 5 storage accounts, or let's say that I had an undetermined number. Like I wanted the consumer of the template to say at deployment time, I want 4 storage accounts. So we can achieve that using what's called a copy loop and potentially some conditions. So for instance, I can put a condition on this resource right here that states something like, well, I'm not going to actually go through it, but I could put a parameter in here like storage count, and then I can write a condition that states like, hey, if parameter count or if storage count is greater than 0, then create this resource and use the number to create that number of storage accounts. So I put in 0, no storage accounts are created. I put in 5 storage accounts are created. So just kind of like, if you want to dig in further, you can do a search for ARM templates, copy loops, ARM templates conditions, and we've got a whole list of conditions that you can use. What I do want to talk about is parameter files. So this is great. I've defined a parameter here, but another thing that you might do as you're building complex or real ARM templates is maybe you have a set of values that you want to input for like your test environment and a different set of values for your production environment. And you don't want to like type them all in at runtime. You just want to like store them in a file. So we can create something called a parameter file that will allow us to do that. And this is some of the new features that we've just released in the ARM tools extension just last week. So we can see I've got one parameter defined. I can now right click on my template, and we've got this option to select create parameter file. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'll click new, and then I'll select all parameters. If I did only required parameters, it would just pull over any parameter that doesn't have a default value. So like I put min length here, max length here. I could also put default value in here. But in this case, I'm just going to do all parameters. And then it's going to ask for a location and a name. And we can see that it's now created a parameter file for me in the same directory. Also notice if I click on my template, down here at the bottom of VS Code, we can see that we've got this mapping between the template and the parameter file. And that was important because within ARM templates themselves, there is no concept of mapping the two, mapping like this template to this parameter file. But we wanted to do that for a couple different reasons, and let me show you why. I'm going to go ahead and remove this comment, and let's just give this a value of AB, and I'll go ahead and save it. But if you recall, our parameter actually has some constraints on it. But right now, the value in my parameters file doesn't meet those constraints. So if I hover over this, you can see that it's validating that that parameter file is not proper for this template at this point. This validation doesn't check out. So if I come over to my parameters file and actually do ABC, save that, come back over to my template, we can now see that my yellow squiggly is gone. One other thing to note is, let me actually just reintroduce that issue. We do squigglies, but just like any kind of IDE, we also have the problems pane down here. So as you're building large, complex templates, you know, this is actually something as a PM for the product I've been doing. It's kind of fun for me is to go out to, we've got this quick start repo of a bunch of templates. I've been taking templates out of that, dropping them in my tools, and then it will just list all of the problems within the template. So that's pretty cool. One last thing, and this is a feature that we don't have. This is coming in the next release, which will just be in a couple weeks. I can come in here and right-click on a parameter and click Go to References, and now I can see everywhere that that parameter has been used across the parameter file and the template file itself. As well, I can come in here and rename this. So I'm going to click on Rename Symbol, and I'll just do storage account name 2, hit enter. And now if we go over to my template, notice that the parameter is renamed there, and then all of the references are renamed. One last thing that I wanted to talk about was dependencies. So we talked about modularity and dependencies. We talked about parallelism and dependencies. I'm going to come in here and create a dependency between storage account 1 and the storage account before it. So I'll click on depends on, drop these in here, and let me put a comma right here. And one way we can create dependencies is by just putting the resource ID of the storage of this storage account in this depends on field. So I'm going to do double quotes, an expression, resource ID, open this up, and this is something that we're going to be adding within the next couple weeks. We can see that I've now got some intelligent IntelliSense. So what's happened here is it's pulled back all of the resources in this template, but not the resource that I'm on. So I can go ahead and click that, click comma, and storage account 1. And I now have a properly formatted resource ID reference back to that storage account. Now, I think I'm just at time, so that's where I'll end. I know that was pretty quick, but I hope it was helpful both in kind of exploring what Azure Resource Manager templates are. One last point, we don't yet have a deployment experience. So we talked about the options for deploying templates. At this point in my workflow within VS Code, I would open up the terminal and just use PowerShell or the Azure CLI command to deploy templates. However, we are currently looking at and have an open work item to add kind of a deployment experience here where you can potentially just right click deploy, kind of go through a wizard to select the resource group, etc. So thanks a lot. Feel free to reach out on Twitter. Really happy to engage on the product. If you just want to talk, or if you're using the product and you want to provide feedback, like absolutely, like I've got no problem. I would love to talk for an hour and just get feedback and kind of I could even pick your brain about some of the features that we're planning and kind of like test them out on you and see what you think of them. So thanks a lot, Alexander, for inviting me. This has been pretty cool. I hope everyone is safe and enjoying your the isolation time at home during this weird time in the world, and really appreciate it.